The Pentagon plan JFK refused and why it scared Washington. In March 1962, in the cabinet room of the White House, President John F. Kennedy sat holding a folder marked Top Secret, Eyes Only. The folder contained a document that would test everything he believed about American democracy and military restraint. The document was titled Operation Northwoods. It wasn't a defensive strategy. It wasn't a contingency plan. It was a proposal to stage incidents and attacks and blame Cuba to justify a full-scale invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had signed it. General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was presenting it. And the plan included hijacking civilian aircraft, sinking American ships, staging bombings in American cities, and risking American lives, all to be blamed on Fidel Castro to create the pretext for war. Kennedy read through the document in silence. His face darkened. When Lemnitzer finished his presentation, Kennedy didn't deliberate. He didn't ask for modifications. He rejected the plan outright and told Lemnitzer it would never be approved. Within months, Kennedy removed Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs and reassigned him to Europe. Operation Northwoods was shelved, classified, and buried in Pentagon archives for 35 years. But the plan's existence revealed something chilling about the military establishment Kennedy was trying to control. Senior planners were willing to consider extreme measures to get the war they wanted.
But to understand why this plan mattered, we need to look at what it actually proposed. If you want to understand how the Pentagon proposed staging incidents that could endanger Americans to justify invading Cuba, and why Kennedy's refusal intensified tensions with the military establishment, hit that like button. This is the plan they kept secret for decades, the document that shows how far the Joint Chiefs were prepared to go to create a case for war. The moment Kennedy saw how dangerous unchecked planning could become. Let's start with what Operation Northwoods actually proposed, because understanding the details is understanding how far the Pentagon was willing to go. Operation Northwoods was developed in 1962 by the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The plan's objective was simple: create a pretext for U.S. military intervention in Cuba by staging attacks and provocations that would be blamed on the Castro government. The document, officially titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, was presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and then to President Kennedy in March 1962. The plan included specific operations. First, stage attacks on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. The proposal suggested blowing up ammunition stores, starting fires, sabotaging aircraft, and causing casualties among American personnel, all to be blamed on Cuban saboteurs. The plan stated explicitly that casualties could be real or simulated, but that real casualties would be more convincing to the American public and international community.
And that was only the beginning. Second, sink a boatload of Cuban refugees fleeing to Florida. The plan proposed staging a fake attack on a boat filled with Cuban exiles, making it appear that Castro's forces had murdered innocent refugees seeking freedom. The refugees would either be actors or, in some versions of the plan, real people who could become genuine casualties. Third, conduct a wave of violent incidents in American cities. The document proposed bombing government facilities, conducting sniper attacks, and creating a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami, Washington, D.C., and other cities. These incidents could kill and wound American citizens, with the deaths blamed on Cuban agents to inflame public opinion. Fourth, hijack civilian aircraft. The plan proposed hijacking a civilian airliner, either actually or through simulation, and claiming Cuban forces shot it down. One version suggested filling a remote-controlled drone aircraft with college students on a mock flight, then destroying it and claiming Cuba was responsible.
Another version suggested actually shooting down a commercial flight and blaming Castro. Fifth, stage attacks on neighboring countries. The proposal included creating incidents in Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and other Caribbean nations that would be blamed on Cuba, demonstrating that Castro was threatening the entire region and required U.S. intervention. The document included detailed timelines, logistical plans, and propaganda strategies. It wasn't a rough outline. It wasn't a theoretical exercise. It was a fully developed operational plan ready for execution pending presidential approval. Think about what this means. The highest-ranking military officers in the United States government proposed a plan that could put American lives at risk to justify a war. Not in a hypothetical discussion, not as a rejected brainstorming idea, as a formal, signed, official proposal presented to the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States. General Lyman Lemnitzer signed Operation Northwoods. So did every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962. Army Chief of Staff General George Decker, Naval Operations Chief Admiral George Anderson, Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, Marine Commandant General David Shoup. These weren't rogue colonels. These were the most senior military leaders in America, men who had commanded forces in World War II and Korea, men who controlled America's nuclear arsenal, men who could launch global war. And the proposal contemplated Americans being harmed. Kennedy's response would define everything that followed.
Kennedy's reaction was immediate and decisive. According to multiple accounts, Kennedy was disgusted by the proposal. He reportedly told Lemnitzer that Operation Northwoods would never be approved under any circumstances, and that the plan represented everything wrong with military thinking divorced from moral and political reality. But Kennedy didn't just reject the plan, he removed the people who proposed it. Lemnitzer's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs was ending in September 1962. Kennedy didn't renew it. Instead, Kennedy reassigned Lemnitzer to Europe as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a prestigious post, but one that removed him from direct influence over U.S. military policy. Kennedy replaced Lemnitzer with General Maxwell Taylor, a military intellectual who Kennedy believed would be more responsive to civilian control. Kennedy also limited the Joint Chiefs' access to the White House. After Operation Northwoods, Kennedy increasingly bypassed the Joint Chiefs in major decisions, relying instead on a small group of civilian advisors, including his brother Robert Kennedy, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and Special Assistant for National Security Affairs McGeorge Bundy. The Joint Chiefs felt sidelined, diminished, disrespected. To understand why this conflict escalated, we need to look back. Why did the Pentagon propose Operation Northwoods? Why were America's top generals willing to consider plans that risked American lives? The answer lies in Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. In April 1961, Kennedy had approved a CIA plan to invade Cuba using anti-Castro exiles. The invasion failed catastrophically. Kennedy refused to provide American air support, refused to commit U.S. troops, and accepted the defeat rather than escalate into full-scale war. The Pentagon and the anti-Castro Cuban exile community viewed Kennedy's refusal to escalate as betrayal. After the Bay of Pigs, the military wanted revenge. They wanted to overthrow Castro. They wanted to prove that military force, properly applied, could achieve what CIA covert operations couldn't. And they needed a pretext, a justification dramatic enough to overcome Kennedy's reluctance to invade Cuba. That same divide would surface again under even greater pressure. The plan wasn't born from madness. It was born from institutional frustration. The military believed Kennedy was weak.
that his refusal to use force emboldened America's enemies, that his desire for negotiation and de-escalation was dangerous naivety. The Joint Chiefs believed they understood threats Kennedy couldn't comprehend, that their experience and expertise justified extreme measures, that protecting America required doing things civilians wouldn't approve. This mindset that military leaders know better than elected officials, that extreme measures are justified by strategic necessity, that the end justifies the means, would define Kennedy's relationship with the Pentagon throughout his presidency. After rejecting Operation Northwoods in March 1962, Kennedy faced another confrontation with the military just months later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The stakes would soon be higher than ever before.
In October 1962, U.S. reconnaissance discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Joint Chiefs recommended immediate airstrikes followed by a full-scale invasion. General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, told Kennedy that airstrikes were the only acceptable option, that a naval blockade would be perceived as weakness, that negotiation would hand the Soviets a victory. Kennedy rejected their advice. He implemented a naval quarantine, not airstrikes. He negotiated with Soviet Premier Khrushchev through secret back channels. He offered to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet missiles leaving Cuba. And he avoided war. LeMay was furious. After the crisis was resolved, LeMay told Kennedy to his face that the resolution was the greatest defeat in our history. Kennedy walked out of the room visibly angry. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy later said he'd never seen Kennedy so upset. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The pattern was clear. Kennedy prioritized negotiation and de-escalation. The Joint Chiefs wanted military action and escalation. Kennedy believed war should be a last resort. The generals believed force was often the best first option. Kennedy thought nuclear war was unthinkable. Some military leaders believed nuclear war was survivable and potentially winnable. This fundamental disagreement came to a head over Vietnam. By 1963, the Joint Chiefs were recommending major escalation in Vietnam, sending combat troops, bombing North Vietnam, potentially using tactical nuclear weapons. Kennedy was moving in the opposite direction. In October 1963, he signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, ordering withdrawal of 1,000 advisors by year's end and planning for complete withdrawal by 1965. And that disagreement would define Kennedy's final year. The military opposed this withdrawal. They believed South Vietnam would fall to communism if America didn't escalate. They believed Kennedy was repeating the mistakes of the Bay of Pigs, showing weakness that would encourage communist aggression globally. They believed Kennedy's policies were destroying American credibility and emboldening enemies. General Curtis LeMay was particularly vocal. LeMay believed nuclear weapons should be used against North Vietnam if necessary. He believed America should fight to win or not fight at all. And he believed Kennedy's caution was cowardice disguised as wisdom. In private conversations, according to multiple sources, LeMay and other generals expressed open contempt for Kennedy. They questioned whether a president who wouldn't use military force could protect American interests. They wondered whether the country needed stronger leadership that understood force, respected military expertise, and wasn't constrained by fear of escalation. What followed would reshape American history. Operation Northwoods revealed how far the military was willing to go without presidential approval. The plan wasn't presented as, if you approve, we'll develop this further. It was presented as a developed operation, ready for execution.
The Joint Chiefs had already done the planning, created the timeline, assigned the resources. They brought Kennedy a finished product, expecting approval. That tells you everything about how the Pentagon viewed civilian control in 1962. They saw it as a formality, an obstacle, something to be managed rather than respected. They believed their expertise and experience gave them the right to develop plans that could endanger Americans, and they expected the president to rubber stamp their proposals. Kennedy shattered that expectation. His rejection of Operation Northwoods, his removal of Lemnitzer, his sidelining of the Joint Chiefs, all sent a clear message. The military served the president, not the other way around. But institutional cultures don't change because one president asserts authority. The Joint Chiefs resented Kennedy. The CIA resented Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs and his attempts to reform the agency. Defense contractors resented Kennedy's attempts to reduce military spending. The anti-Castro Cuban exile community resented Kennedy for refusing to invade Cuba. And all of these groups had relationships with each other, shared objectives, and common opposition to Kennedy's policies. Operation Northwoods remained classified for decades. When it was finally declassified in the 1990s, historians were stunned, not because it proved wrongdoing had occurred, but because it demonstrated how far senior military leaders were willing to plan in pursuit of war. The document showed that America's highest-ranking generals had seriously proposed actions that violated fundamental democratic principles, actions that required a president willing to say no. John F. Kennedy said no. And he didn't stop there. He removed General Lyman Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He restricted the influence of military leadership in future decisions, and he repeatedly chose negotiation over escalation, even when his generals insisted force was the only solution. This created one of the most strained civil-military relationships in modern American history. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy rejected calls for airstrikes and invasion. In Vietnam, he resisted pressure to deploy combat troops. In nuclear policy, he pushed for restraint rather than dominance. These decisions didn't make him popular inside the national security establishment. They made him controversial. What happened next is a matter of historical debate. President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. Investigations have never produced definitive proof of who was responsible, and historians continue to examine the evidence from multiple perspectives. What is beyond dispute is what followed. After Kennedy's death, many of the policies he resisted were reversed. The withdrawal from Vietnam was canceled. Military involvement expanded. Defense spending increased. The United States entered a war Kennedy had been deeply skeptical of fighting. Whether these outcomes were coincidence, consequence, or something more complex remains an open question, one that scholars still debate today. Operation Northwoods matters because it reminds us that power does not always move in the open. It operates through institutions, doctrines, and assumptions, often far from public view. Kennedy's refusal showed that civilian leadership can restrain military power, but only when it actively chooses to do so. That struggle did not end with his presidency, and it did not end with his death. If this story changed how you think about power, war, and presidential authority, support this work by liking the video. Subscribe to Unfinished History for more stories drawn from declassified documents, historical records, and scholarly research. History doesn't repeat, but it leaves evidence behind. And sometimes that evidence tells us more about power than any official speech ever could.